They sold her like livestock, with rope around her wrists and shame in her eyes. But one man didn't bid to own her. He bid to free her. The air was heavy with dust that afternoon, the kind that clung to the back of the throat and made every breath taste of grit. Men had gathered in the square, hats pulled low, boots planted firm on the boards, as if they were here to buy cattle or mules, not people. The auctioneer stood high on the platform, his voice carrying sharp above the restless murmur, his words like a knife cutting away whatever dignity the souls before him once carried. One by one, men and women were brought up, some with eyes full of fire, others already hollowed by shame, and the crowd called out prices, as though bartering for grain. When they brought her out, a hush fell for a moment, then laughter followed. She was small, her wrists tied before her, a plain dress hanging loose on her thin frame. Her skin was pale, her hair dark as midnight, falling uncombed around her face. She did not look at the crowd, her gaze fixed on the dirt at her feet, though the auctioneer gripped her arm and turned her toward them as if to show off a prize. The men jeered and spat, calling her strange, a curiosity, some muttering words she could not understand, but whose cruelty was plain. The auctioneer barked that she was hardy, that she had crossed the ocean, that she was strong and would not complain, and the bidding began. Voices sharp with mockery. $1, then $2, a few snickers. A man in the back shouted $3 and the crowd chuckled as if he had done it for sport. She stood unmoving, eyes dull, as though her spirit had already been sold long before this day. The auctioneer looked impatient, sweat sliding down his temple, his hand lifted high waiting for more. The laughter began to fade, men shaking their heads, losing interest, turning away toward the saloon. That was when Luke Harding spoke. His voice was low, but it carried enough. 4. The word cut through the noise, plain and final. The auctioneer blinked, his mouth twitching with surprise. $4 was hardly more than the price of a worn saddle, but no other bid came. No one wanted her. Not really. Not for more than the joke of it. The gavel came down with a crack like a gunshot, and the deal was sealed. The crowd muttered, some shaking their heads, some smirking, but Luke did not look at them. He stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over her, and without a word he took the rope from the auctioneer's hand. For a moment she stiffened, bracing for the tug, for the rough yank forward. Instead, he pulled a small knife from his belt and cut the bindings at her wrists. The rope fell to the boards, and she blinked as if she had forgotten what it felt like to be free, even for a breath. He draped his coat over her shoulders and nodded toward his horse. The crowd fell into silence, the jeers dead on their lips. In a world where $4 bought nothing of worth, Luke Harding had given it for a girl no one else wanted, and the weight of that choice hung heavier than the dust in the air. The street emptied slowly after the auction, men drifting toward the saloon and women gathering whispers on the boardwalk. Hannah kept her eyes lowered, her wrists still raw from the rope. She waited for the sting of a strike, or the sharp bark of an order, the way she had learned to brace herself when men grew impatient. But no hand came, only the rough fabric of a coat set gently across her shoulders. She lifted her head just enough to see the tall figure standing beside her, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes unreadable but not cruel. His silence was not like the silence of the jeering crowd, not heavy with judgment or scorn, but a quiet that gave her space she did not know what to do with. He motioned for her to follow, and her feet obeyed, though her heart thudded with dread. She thought he would drag her, but instead he walked at a pace she could keep, pausing when she stumbled, steadying her with a firm hand under her elbow. The touch startled her, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. She glanced up once, quick as a sparrow, and found his gaze already forward, as though her clumsiness was no shame to him, no matter for laughter or anger. They reached his horse, a broad-chested bay with a dark mane, reins hanging loose, as if the animal trusted its master too much to wander. Luke set his hands at Hannah's waist and lifted her onto the saddle. She stiffened, waiting for roughness, but the lift was steady, careful, and he stepped back once she was seated, as though keeping distance was part of his promise. He mounted behind her, not close enough to press, but near enough that she felt his presence like a shield at her back. The town grew smaller as they rode out, the sound of voices fading until only the rhythm of hooves filled the air. Hannah wrapped the coat tighter around herself, its weight strange but comforting, its smell of leather and smoke unlike anything she had known. The wind tugged at her hair, and for the first time since she was pulled onto that stage, she allowed herself to breathe without fear of who might be watching. Her thoughts churned as the miles passed. Men had always looked at her as though she were less than human, a thing to be traded, mocked, or ignored. This man said little, yet his silence confused her more than their cruelty ever had. If he meant to harm her, why untie her wrists? Why shield her with his coat? If he meant to own her, why ride as though she were not a possession but a companion? She dared not hope. Hope was dangerous, yet something stirred deep inside her that was not fear, not yet trust, but something caught between. The sun dipped low and painted the plains with fire. She turned her head slightly, not enough to meet his eyes, but enough to sense his watchfulness. Luke Harding did not speak, but she felt the weight of his shadow stretching over her, not like a chain but like a shelter, and she could not understand why it made her chest ache more than any insult ever had. The horse carried them out past the edge of town, where the land stretched wide and bare beneath a sky already cooling into twilight. Hannah held the coat close around her shoulders, afraid to move, afraid to ask where he was taking her. She watched the fences roll by, many broken weeds climbing high between the rails. The fields were dry, the kind that once promised life but now looked tired. When Luke slowed the horse and guided it through a gate hanging by one hinge, she realized they had arrived. The house stood ahead, not large, not fine, just weather, beaten boards bleached gray by sun and wind. The porch sagged a little, the roof showed patches of rust, and the windows stared out empty like eyes that had seen too much. There were no voices, no lanterns burning, no sign of another soul. Only the sound of the horse's hooves and the whisper of wind through dry grass. Luke helped her down, his hands steady as always, then tied the reins to the post. Hannah stood on the dirt path, her eyes fixed on the house. She thought of the auction block, of the sneers that followed her, and she wondered what awaited her inside these lonely walls. She had known crowded places full of cruel voices, and she had known the silence of cages, but this silence felt heavier, as though it belonged to the land itself. He opened the door and motioned for her to follow. Inside was no better than the outside. The boards creaked underfoot. The air carried the faint smell of dust and wood smoke long burned away. A table stood in the center of the room, a chair at each side and one at the head, worn smooth by use. A picture frame rested face down on the mantel, its glass cracked, as though someone had not wanted to look at it anymore. The stove sat cold, its black iron belly empty, and in the corner an old trunk stood closed tight with no lock. Luke set his hat on a peg by the door and turned toward her. His eyes were not sharp, not soft either, but weighed down by things unspoken. "No chains here," he said, his voice quiet yet firm. "Only work, if you'll have it." She didn't answer, her throat tight, her hands clutching the coat as if it might still protect her. She didn't know what he meant. Did he mean servant, wife, prisoner, guest? The words blurred together in her head. She sat on the porch instead, knees pulled close, staring out across the wide field that seemed to go on forever. For the first time since she had been taken from her homeland, no one told her what she was. The choice hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned out long ago. Luke said nothing more. He busied himself with the horse, brushing down its flanks, his back to her. The house stood behind them, empty yet waiting, and Hannah realized the silence she feared most was not the kind that came with cruelty, but the kind that left her to decide who she was meant to be. The sun had already sunk low when Luke struck a match and lit the small lamp on the table. Its glow filled the room only halfway, leaving the corners wrapped in shadow. He set down 2 bowls, each holding a simple stew of beans and a strip of salt pork. The kind of meal a man could eat every day without thought. Hannah sat stiff in her chair, unsure if she should wait, unsure if she should even touch the spoon set before her. She had been fed scraps before, tossed food like one might throw to a dog, so this place at a table felt strange, almost dangerous, as if reaching out might break some unseen rule. Luke lowered himself into the chair opposite her. His shoulders filled the space, yet he moved with a kind of weariness, as though each motion cost him. For a moment, his eyes lifted toward the chair at the head of the table. It sat empty, its surface worn smooth, the high back casting a crooked shadow against the wall. He lingered there, his gaze heavy, before he closed his eyes and bowed his head. His voice was low, roughened by dust and years, as he muttered words of grace. Hannah didn't understand them all, but she heard the tremor that slipped through, a crack in the armor of a man who carried his grief like a stone in his chest. She lowered her head too, not in the way he did, not to thank a God she barely knew, but in memory of her mother, her brothers, all the faces that had been torn from her long before this night. When the prayer ended, silence filled the room once more. Hannah lifted her spoon. Each clink against the bowl echoed as if the house itself had been waiting for noise, and now every sound seemed too loud. Luke ate slowly, methodically, his eyes fixed on the food, though she saw his gaze wander again to the empty chair, as if expecting someone to return. She wanted to ask who had sat there, who he still waited for, but her tongue felt thick and she had no words for the questions burning inside her. She stole glances at him when he was not looking. His face was weathered, lines carved deep around his mouth and eyes, but there was no cruelty in them, only the heaviness of someone who had outlived too many. His hands were scarred, strong hands that could break or build, yet they rested quiet on the table, not clenched, not restless. When her bowl was half empty, she set the spoon down and folded her hands in her lap. She expected him to frown, to tell her to eat more, but he said nothing. The quiet stretched on until the lamp flickered, its flame bending in a draught. Luke finally pushed back his chair, stood, and took her bowl, setting it in the basin without a word. The house breathed with silence, yet beneath it, Hannah felt the weight of unseen ghosts pressing close, his and hers alike. She had thought grief was hers alone, a secret burden no one could share. But watching the way his eyes lingered on that empty chair, she realized loss spoke in every language. The morning air was cool when Luke hitched the wagon and told Hannah to climb up. She obeyed without question, clutching the coat he had given her, unsure if she was being taken back to town or to some new place she could not picture. The road stretched dusty and wide, the sun climbing slow behind them. She sat stiff beside him, her hands folded tight, afraid to speak. He said little, only gave the reins a steady flick now and then, his eyes fixed ahead. They reached the general store just as other townsfolk were gathering. Men leaned against posts, their hats tilted back. Women walked with baskets on their arms, and the sound of talk drifted like the hum of flies. Hannah felt the weight of eyes the moment she stepped down from the wagon. Whispers stirred, and she kept close to Luke, her head bowed, her hair falling forward like a curtain to shield her face. One man, broad-shouldered, with a smirk that told her he enjoyed being cruel, tipped his hat and called out, loud enough for all to hear. "Well now, Harding, how's the auction girl doing? Still worth your $4? Laughter followed, sharp and cutting, and Hannah froze where she stood. The words dug deep, the way they always had, as if she were nothing but a mark of shame. Before she could shrink further, Luke's voice came clear and steady. "Her name is Hannah Harding." His tone left no room for question, no opening for more laughter. The crowd fell quiet, the smirk on the man's face slipping just a little. Luke turned his gaze on him, hard and unflinching, then guided Hannah toward the store without another word. Hannah's steps faltered. The name rang in her ears like a bell. Hannah Harding. She had been called many things, most of them cruel. Some meant to strip her of whatever dignity she tried to hold. But never had anyone given her a name that tethered her to a place, to a person, to something that felt solid. Her breath caught, and for a moment she forgot how to walk, her chest tightening in a way that scared her. Inside the store, Luke gathered what he needed: flour, coffee, nails for mending the fences. He spoke to the shopkeeper as if nothing had happened outside, his voice calm, his manner unchanged. Hannah stood near the door, her hands trembling against the folds of the coat, her mind circling that single sentence he had spoken. He did not look at her, did not explain, did not soften the weight of it, but he had spoken it to the world, and the world had heard. When they left, she climbed back onto the wagon without waiting for his hand, her movements uncertain, but stronger somehow. The road stretched before them once more, and though Luke kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, she found herself glancing at him, searching for some sign, some reason. He gave none, only sat steady beside her, the reins loose in his hands, the silence between them carrying more than words ever could. For the first time, Hannah felt the faint stir of belonging. She was no longer nameless, no longer just the auction girl. She was Hannah Harding, though she did not yet understand what it meant, and the thought filled her chest with a warmth she had never known. The days settled into a rhythm Hannah had never known before. At first, she moved carefully, waiting for the sharp word or the strike that always seemed to come when she faltered, but it never came. Luke showed her the garden behind the house, rows gone dry from neglect, weeds reaching high among the beans. He handed her a hoe and pointed, his voice low, steady, telling her which stalks to save and which to cut. She bent to the work, her hands blistering, her back aching. But when she glanced up, he only nodded, as though to say she was doing fine. No scorn, no anger, only patience that felt strange, almost foreign. When clothes needed mending, he left them folded on the table with a needle and thread, never asking if she knew how, never scolding when her first stitches came out uneven. She worked by lamplight, her fingers pricked and sore, yet each time she improved. Luke never praised her, yet the way he wore the mended shirts without comment told her the work was enough. The horses were the hardest. She had feared them since her journey west, the great beasts stamping and snorting as though they carried storms inside them. But Luke led her into the stable, his hand on the mare's flank, his calm voice steadying both animal and girl. He guided Hannah's hand along the smooth coat, showing her how to saddle, how to tighten straps without hurting, how to move slowly so the horse would not startle. Her heart hammered each time, but she found the animal's warmth grounding, the steady breath against her palm, making her believe she might not always be afraid. One afternoon, he lifted a rifle from the rack and handed it to her. She froze, staring at the weapon as though it might leap to life and strike her down. Luke stood beside her, his eyes quiet, waiting. His hands guided hers, showing her where to rest the stock, how to line her sight with the horizon. The rifle was heavy, her arms trembling, but he did not mock her weakness. Instead, he showed her again and again, until the weight felt less like a threat and more like something she could hold if she had to. Their words remained few. Luke never filled the silence with chatter, never forced questions from her lips. He would point to the sky and say rain, or nod toward the west and say wind. She began to see how the clouds spoke to him, how he read the land as if it were an open book. She listened, watched, and learned, finding pride in understanding without needing long explanations. At night, when she lay down, she thought about how different his silence felt. Others had used silence as punishment, a weapon sharper than any word, a way to make her feel small. Luke's silence was different. It gave her space to breathe, to make mistakes, to grow. She began to see that quiet was not always weakness, not always shame. In his company, Silence became strength, and she carried that strength with her, like a seed waiting to take root. The first time Hannah went back to town with Luke after the auction, the air felt heavier than the day she had been sold. Then she had been nameless, an object for men to jeer at, but now she carried the name Harding, and with it came a different kind of weight. The wagon wheels creaked down the main street, and though no one shouted this time, she could feel the stares pressing into her like needles. Men leaned against posts with their arms folded, some smirking, some spitting in the dust as she passed. Women turned their heads away, clutching their baskets closer, their whispers sharp enough to cut. At the store, Luke helped her down from the wagon. His hand was steady, his back straight, but his jaw was tight, as if he were holding back words he refused to waste on fools. Hannah kept her eyes low, clutching the edge of his coat for courage, though shame twisted in her chest. She heard a man's voice carry across the boardwalk, laughing that Luke Harding had bought himself a foreign bride for the price of a bottle of whiskey. Laughter followed, and Hannah's face burned. She wanted to vanish into the dust, to slip into the earth and be unseen, as she had spent so much of her life. Luke turned then, his voice cutting through the noise. "You walk with me," he said, firm but not unkind. "Not behind me." She looked up, startled. For a moment her feet refused to move, but then she forced herself to step beside him, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She kept her chin lifted, though her hands trembled, though every muscle in her wanted to shrink. Inside the store the whispers followed. The shopkeeper's wife looked her up and down, lips pursed in disapproval, muttering about disgrace. Luke gathered flour, coffee, nails, the small things needed for a ranch that still stood, though much of it leaned with wear. Hannah trailed him at first, her eyes on the floor, but when he glanced back at her she straightened. He said nothing, only handed her a sack of beans to carry, and in that simple act treated her not as shame, not as burden, but as someone who had a place at his side. On the walk back through town, she dared to look once at the people watching. Their faces were twisted with disdain, some curious, some mocking. Yet Luke walked steady, shoulders broad, head high, as if their scorn was no more than wind passing through dry grass. Hannah matched his pace, her steps uneven at first, but then growing stronger. She felt their eyes burn into her, and though her heart still quaked, she held herself upright. When they reached the wagon, Luke helped her up once more and guided the horse forward. The town fell behind them, the laughter and whispers fading into distance. Hannah sat with her hands clenched in her lap, her breath tight, but a strange warmth settled in her chest. He had not defended her with long words or with fists, but with the simple act of standing beside her. For the first time she realized she did not have to walk with her head bent forever. She could walk beside someone, even when the world turned its back. The storm came sudden from the west, rolling black clouds across the plains until the whole sky shook with thunder. Rain pounded the roof in sheets, slipping through cracks and rattling the shutters like fists on a door. Hannah sat near the fire, the coat still around her shoulders, mending one of Luke's shirts with thread that trembled in her fingers. Each crash of lightning lit the room in stark flashes, making the shadows stretch long across the walls. Luke sat at the table with a bottle of whiskey open before him. He had not spoken much that day, only enough to ask for chores or point toward what needed fixing. But tonight, his silence was different. His shoulders sagged, as if the storm itself weighed on him, and his eyes, usually steady, drifted toward the empty chair at the head of the table. He poured himself another glass, his hand unsteady, and swallowed it in one motion. Hannah kept her eyes on the fire. She had learned to read silences, to measure the danger inside them. She had known men whose quiet came before a storm of anger, and she braced herself without meaning to. But when Luke spoke, his voice was low, cracked, like a man talking not to her but to the ghosts in his own chest. "My brother," he muttered, the words slurring at the edges. "He shouldn't have gone. Promised Ma I'd keep him safe." His hand shook as he poured another drink, the liquid spilling onto the wood. War took him anyway. Took more than him. Took every damn thing we thought we were fighting for. Hannah set down the needle and thread, her heart thudding. She turned to him slowly, watching the way his eyes glistened in the lamplight. He was not looking at her, not even at the room, but at something far behind, something buried in fields of memory she could not see. His jaw clenched, his voice a whisper now. I told him I'd bring him home, but I came back alone. The fire popped, sending sparks upward. Hannah moved closer, kneeling on the rug, the warmth at her back and the storm at her front. She did not speak, for she had no words that could reach him. But she listened. She listened the way no one had listened to her when she carried her own grief. And she realized then that the man who had cut her bonds, who had given her his name, carried chains heavier than hers. For so long she had seen him as savior, as shield, as a figure too solid to be broken. But now, watching him slump over the table, muttering to a brother who would never answer, she saw the truth. He was not savior or master. He was a wounded soul, scarred by loss, bound by guilt, surviving one day to the next. His silence, which she had thought strength alone, was also a cage he had built around his pain. Hannah's hands tightened in her lap. She wanted to reach for him, to steady him the way he had steadied her by the horse that first night. But she did not. Instead, she bowed her head, not in shame but in kinship. The storm raged outside, but inside she understood that they were both marked by sorrow, both carrying the weight of ghosts. And in that quiet recognition, something in her heart shifted, fragile, yet real. A bond not of debt, but of shared brokenness. The creek cut low through the ridge, its water running clear over stones worn smooth by years of flow. Hannah had gone there with a bucket in hand, her steps careful along the narrow path, the sound of birds filling the late afternoon air. She liked the creek, the way the current whispered, the way its coolness felt against her fingers when the sun pressed hot on her back. Here she could breathe a little easier, away from the eyes of town and even from Luke's steady silence. She bent to fill the bucket, her hair falling forward, when the crunch of boots on gravel froze her in place. 3 men stood on the ridge above, ranch hands she had seen once before at a distance. Their grins were sharp, their hats tilted low. One spat into the dirt, his eyes narrowing with the kind of amusement that always carried cruelty behind it. Well, if it ain't Harding's little bargain, he drawled, stepping closer. Auction girl fetching water like a proper wife. Tell me, does he keep you in the barn, or let you at his table? The others laughed, the sound bouncing off the rocks like a cruel echo. Hannah's chest tightened, her hands gripping the bucket, though her arms shook. She kept her head low, hoping they would tire of her quickly, but another voice cut sharp through the air. Don't hide your face, girl. We paid good coin to see your shame once already. A hand reached out, rough fingers catching her sleeve, tugging her forward. She stumbled, her knees striking the stones, the bucket tipping, water spilling out in a silver sheet. Her breath came fast, her throat tight with old fear. She had known this before. The sneers, the jeers, the hands that claimed what they had no right to claim. But before panic could swallow her, a voice split the air, deep and fierce. Let her go. Luke's shadow fell across the ridge. He came down the path like a storm, his fists clenched, his face set hard. The ranch hand holding Hannah barely had time to turn before Luke's fist struck, the sound of bone meeting bone sharp as a rifle crack. The man dropped to the ground, blood already staining the rocks beneath him. The other 2 lunged, but Luke met them without pause. He moved with the raw force of a man who fought not for pride but for something far heavier. His fists swung merciless, each blow fueled by more than anger. Hannah scrambled back, her heart racing as she watched. Blood splattered across the stones, groans filling the air, yet Luke did not stop until all 3 lay beaten, cursing weakly into the dirt. When he finally straightened, his chest heaved, his knuckles raw and red. His eyes found Hannah, and she saw in them not just rage but something deeper, something that burned hotter than fury, fear. Not fear of the men, not fear of the fight, but fear of losing her. Hannah pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her body shaking. No one had ever fought for her before, not like this. She had always been a burden, a weight others cast off. But standing there, blood on the stones, and Luke's eyes blazing with a terror he would never name, she understood. She was no longer just something he had bought. She was something he could not bear to lose. The first light of dawn spilled pale across the fields, painting the boards of the old house in muted gold. The storm of yesterday lingered in the air, not with thunder, but with the kind of stillness that warned of more trouble. Luke sat on the porch, a whetstone in his hand, the long knife across his knee. The rasp of steel against stone cut through the quiet morning, steady but uneven, each stroke marked by the tremor in his hands. His jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff, and though his eyes stayed on the blade, his thoughts were far away, circling like vultures over the memory of blood on the ridge. "They'll come again," he muttered, barely more than a growl. But Hannah heard him through the screen door. She had been watching him from the shadows, her fingers pressed to the wood, the sound of his voice heavy in her chest. She knew the men would not forget the beating he had given them, and she knew the look in Luke's eyes had not been anger alone. It was fear, the kind that wrapped itself around him, even now, long after the danger had passed. Hannah stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet light against the worn boards. For a moment she stood unsure, her heart racing, but then she moved to his side. The knife gleamed under the rising sun, its edge keen, ready, but she looked past it to his face. His eyes were fixed on the blade as though sharpening it might give him control over a world that refused to be tamed. She reached out, slow, hesitant, and laid her hand on his arm. The muscles beneath tensed, then eased just slightly at her touch. Luke turned his head toward her, his eyes shadowed, his lips pressed thin. He looked as though he might speak, might tell her to go inside, but the words never came. The silence stretched, thick with all the things neither of them had said. Hannah's throat tightened. For so long words had been dangerous to her, twisted into weapons, laughed at when she tried to use them. But now, standing in the quiet beside the man who had cut her bonds and stood against the world for her, she felt something rise inside her that could not be swallowed down. She leaned closer, her voice trembling yet certain, and whispered the single word she had carried, but never dared to speak. Family. The word struck him harder than any blow. His breath caught, the knife slipping in his hand, so that it clattered to the porch. He stared at her, disbelief flickering in his eyes. Then something else, something breaking, something loosening, that had been locked away for years. The hard lines of his face softened, his shoulders sagged, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, a smile touched his lips. It was small, crooked, uncertain, but real. Hannah felt her own chest swell, her hand still resting on his arm, her heart pounding at the fragile, powerful truth between them. The sun rose higher, the fields stirring with light, and though the threat of men still lingered, though the world would not forget its scorn, here on the porch a bond had been forged, not of coin or duty, but of something unspoken, made flesh at last. The night was still when the first crackle split the quiet, sharp as dry twigs snapping underfoot. Hannah stirred from her bed, the smell of smoke already seeping through the cracks of the old house. She rushed to the window and saw it, flames leaping from the barn, orange tongues clawing high into the darkness. Her heart lurched, and she shouted Luke's name, her voice breaking the silence. He was already at the door, boots half pulled on, rifle in hand, though he dropped it once he saw the fire. His eyes burned hotter than the blaze itself. "They did this," he muttered, his teeth clenched, but there was no time for rage. The barn was going fast, and the horses screamed inside, their panic rising with the smoke. Luke tore across the yard, Hannah at his heels, though her legs trembled beneath her. The heat hit them before they reached the doors, the air thick and choking. Luke wrenched the latch free, forcing the doors wide, smoke pouring out like a beast unleashed. One by one he led the animals out, slapping their flanks to drive them into the night. Hannah grabbed buckets, racing to the pump, her arms straining as she hauled water again and again, stumbling under the weight. The flames ate greedily, sparks showering down on her hair and shoulders, but she did not stop. She ran back and forth, her small frame moving through the chaos, every breath burning her lungs. Luke heaved hay bales aside to stop the fire from spreading, his body already blackened with soot, sweat streaking through the grime. The roar of the blaze drowned everything, yet he kept shouting to her, his voice fierce, pulling her back each time the smoke grew too thick. At one moment the ground gave beneath her as she tripped on a fallen beam. She cried out, the bucket spilling, flames sparking inches from her face. Luke was there in a heartbeat, his arms hauling her up as if she weighed nothing. "Hannah!" he roared, his voice breaking with more than fear, more than anger. It was desperation, raw and unguarded, echoing across the valley so that even the fire seemed to pause. He held her tight for a breath before setting her on her feet again. "Stay with me," he said, and though his voice shook, his eyes blazed with something she had never seen before. Together they fought until the night thinned, and the flames finally sagged into smoke. The barn stood blackened, half collapsed, but the worst had been stopped. The last sparks hissed under water, the yard littered with ash, the horses standing wide-eyed in the dark. Luke dropped to his knees, coughing hard, his body spent. Hannah knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his soot-streaked face. For a long time neither spoke. The bond between them did not need words. Not anymore. When dawn crept over the horizon, the barn smoldering behind them, they sat side by side, hands clasped, breath ragged. The fire had taken much, but it had also given something neither had expected. Their silence no longer walled them apart. It bound them. It was unbreakable. The spring rains came soft and steady, soaking into the soil that only weeks before had been black with ash. The barn still bore the scars of the fire, half its timbers charred and leaning, but the fields beyond were already stirring with green. Shoots of grass pushed through the burned earth as if the land itself refused to stay broken. Hannah walked barefoot along the furrows, the hem of her dress brushing the damp ground, a small pouch clutched to her chest. Inside were cherry seeds, the last gift from her mother, carried across the ocean through every hardship. She knelt by the porch, her fingers sinking into the cool earth, and planted them carefully, one by one, whispering words in her own tongue that the prairie winds carried away. Luke watched from the steps, his hands rough with work, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. When she rose, brushing dirt from her palms, he came down with hammer and nails, carrying the frame of a bench he had built from what boards the fire had spared. He set it near the place she had planted, driving each nail with quiet purpose. "One day they'll bloom," he said, his voice low, almost certain. "When they do, you'll have shade to sit in." Hannah touched the bench when it was finished, running her fingers over the smooth wood, her chest swelling with something she had not dared feel before. She wore his name now, not because it was forced on her, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had chosen it. Harding was no longer a weight chained to her. It was a shield, a promise, a bond carved as sure as the bench beneath the young seeds. The days passed slow but full. She rose with the sun, feeding the horses, tending the garden, her hands finding new strength in each task. Luke rebuilt the barn board by board, his frame bent with effort, sweat darkening his shirt. Yet every evening he sat with her on the bench, their silence now companionable, no longer empty. She began to laugh sometimes, small sounds at first, then clearer, breaking through the stillness of the ranch like bird song. And when he smiled back, the years of sorrow seemed to lift a little from his shoulders. Neighbors still whispered, some still sneered when they passed through town, but their words carried less weight than they once had. Luke walked steady, Hannah at his side, and no one dared step between them. The name he had spoken for her that day at the store had become more than protection. It was truth. She belonged, not as property, not as burden, but as his equal, his family. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned red, Hannah sat on the bench beneath the place where the cherry seeds slept. Luke lowered himself beside her, his arm brushing hers, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "This is home," he said simply. She nodded, her hand finding his, her heart steady. In the wide, harsh land that had once cast them both aside, they had carved something rare, something no fire or scorn could take away. It was theirs. It was enough. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.